right, let's get started. We have a full agenda today, and so want to make sure we use your time well. This is Bonnie McFarland, and here with our team today. And it seems like we never run out of things to talk with you folks about. I think that's reflective of how much work you all do and how many programs you all are responsible for. So with us today is our team. You'll be hearing from all of them: Rachel Garcia uh, and Amy Tomamatsu, Evan Bartelheim, and Jeannie Keith. And did I leave anyone out? Adrian Balcazar. How could I forget Adrian? So you will hear from all of us today. So let's take a look at our agenda for today. And it looks short, but it's deep, okay? It's one of those deep but wide agendas. So each of these are big topics in themselves. First, we're going to do a review of the comprehensive and support and improvement, some reminders. We did a webinar on that just last week for CSI school districts only, but we just want to provide an update for anyone who missed that and some additional information. Then we're going to take a look at CARES Act and funding sources, reporting, some allowable uses, information on various CARES Act funding sources. Then, as much as we thought it was over, we're back to the CARES Equitable Services program and services. So we'll take a look at some updates on that. Federal program monitoring, some changes that have come particularly with UCP, also some other information on FPM that's updated. We'll be looking at CalPADS and specifically some new updates in CalPADS that affect you and the programs that you operate. And then we're going to take a look at the continuity plan moving forward and where we are on that. So as I said, each of those are very significant topics and we have a lot of information. So as a result, we'll be using the Q&A today and the chat and in the box and ask you to type in your questions. We think some of these topics we're quite sure are going to raise more questions sometimes than they answer. And due to the time we have available, the amount of topics we're covering, and in addition, the fact that some of the responses are going to perhaps be fairly detailed and require us to do some follow-up, we will get back to you in our Q&A format as we always do within the next few days. We appreciate that you have revised your schedules. We adjusted the time. This was originally scheduled for tomorrow, but we know that CDE in conjunction with Brustein and Manasavit have put on a few workshops, and some of you have attended one last week and may be attending tomorrow on the Uniform Grants Guidance. So we adjusted the time of this meeting to accommodate that. We will be addressing some of the topics that were covered in last week's Brustein and Manasavit presentation in less depth, but for those of you who missed it, we will be addressing those. So to start with, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who's going to provide you with just an update on CSI requirements.
Thank you, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone. So as Bonnie mentioned, in this section, we just have a few reminders and updates regarding the requirements for CSI. Next slide, please. This chart highlights the CSI identification and funding timeline. Current CSI schools were identified in January 2020 based on the 2019 dashboard. And LEAs were able to apply for funding for those schools in February 2020. Those funds applied for were fiscal year 2019-20 funds and are currently available through September 2021. Schools identified in the prior year based on the 2018 dashboard were funded with 2018-19 funds. And these funds were scheduled to expire on September 30th, 2020, but were included in the federal flexibility waiver, so LEAs have an additional year to spend any remaining funds for services for those schools. With the elimination of the 2020 dashboard, no new schools will be identified for CSI this year. However, the CDE has indicated that there will be additional funding to support current CSI schools. The CDE anticipates releasing the application for fiscal year 2020-21 CSI funds in early January. And eligibility would be based on schools that were identified for CSI based on the 2019 dashboard. And these funds must be used to develop and implement CSI plans in the 2021-22 school year. It's important to note that whether or not the LEA applied for CSI funds, the requirements for LEAs with CSI schools still apply. Next slide, please. So periodic reporting is required for the CSI grants. And as a result of the challenges of school closures in the spring, the reporting timelines have been revised for this year. This chart shows the revised grant reporting dates for 2019-20 CSI funds. The first report will be due at the end of this month and will provide an opportunity to make any necessary adjustments to the LEA's funding plan and will require a reporting of expenditures as of September 30th. Report 2 has been moved to February and will require reporting of the date of the CSI plan approval. So LEAs will need to ensure that CSI plans for current CSI schools are developed and approved by that time. And the next slide reviews the requirements for CSI plans. So based on federal ESSA requirements, here are the components that CSI plans must include. So first, the plan must be informed by all state indicators, including performance against state-determined long-term goals. It must be based on a school-level needs assessment and must include evidence-based interventions to address the findings from the needs assessment. The plan must also identify any resource inequities to be addressed through implementation of the plan. It's also important to note that EdCode allows for the SIPSA to be used as the CSI plan as long as the SIPSA meets the federal ESSA requirements. Next slide, please. Although there is no required timeline for CSI plans, the CDE has shared this planning timeline for current CSI schools. In normal times, it would be expected that the CSI plan is in place at the start of the school year. However, due to school closures in the spring, CSI plan development may have begun in the spring and then continued into the fall. The CDE recommends that CSI plans for current CSI schools be approved at the school and LEA level by November, and that plan implementation begin by January. As noted previously, LEAs will be reporting the CSI plan approval date in Report 2, due in February in GMARC. Next slide, please. LEAs with schools identified for CSI based on the 2019 dashboard must complete the 2020-21 CSI prompts and submit them to the County Office of Education for review and approval by October 31st, 2020. There are 3 prompts that must be addressed, and these are the same 3 prompts that LEAs previously addressed in the LCAP. The first prompt asks LEAs to list the schools that are eligible for CSI. Prompt 2 asks LEAs to describe how the LEA has or will support its eligible schools in developing CSI plans. And the third prompt asks LEAs to describe how the LEA will monitor and evaluate the implementation and the effectiveness of the plan to support student and school improvement. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see a screenshot of the CSI prompts form and instructions that the CDE has developed for LEAs to use for completion of the prompts. Next slide, please. This graphic shows the timeline and process for completion, submission, and approval of the 2021 CSI prompts. As mentioned, the CSI prompts must be submitted to the County Office of Education for review and approval by October 31st. County offices must then review and approve the CSI prompts and submit a list of LEAs with approved prompts to the CDE by December 1st. The CDE will then compile the list of LEAs with approved CSI prompts for approval by the state board at the January state board meeting. Next slide, please. So school districts and charter schools will need to submit the CSI prompts to LACO through the LCAP system by October 31st. And this is the same system previously used to submit the learning continuity plan. So first, you'll log in to the LCAP system with your same username and password. Once you are logged in, you will click on the CSI prompts in the left sidebar. Next, you will click on the orange button that reads Add CSI Prompts. Next slide, please. As step 4 indicates, you will enter the required fields. The plan title will not appear on the document. And please note that the date of adoption is not a required field. However, if this is part of your local process, you may include an adoption date. But there is no requirement to have the CSI prompts board approved. You'll also need to enter your LEA type and name, contact person name, email, and phone number. For step 5 in the purple section, you will click on Choose File. And you'll want to make sure that you have saved your document as a PDF file. Then you will locate that file and select it. For step 6, once you select the PDF file of your CSI prompts, you will click on the green cloud button to upload the file to the system. You will see the name of your file in the box. And once the upload is complete, you can move to step 7, where you will click the Submit button. After submission of CSI prompts, we will be reviewing the prompts, and if there are any missing components, we will be contacting the LEA contact person to revise or add any missing information so that the prompts can be approved. This contact and revision process will take place during the month of November because, as previously mentioned, the deadline to submit the list of LEAs with approved CSI prompts to the CDE is December 1st. Please note that the process to submit the CSI prompts is not yet functional in the LCAP system, but it should be ready by this Thursday. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, there are several CSI items that are all due on October 31st. So the first item listed is the 2021 CSI prompts. And again, this is for schools identified based on the 2019 dashboard, and this must be submitted to LACO through the LCAP system. The next item listed is Report 1 for 2019-20 CSI funds. Report 1 includes the funding plan adjustment, budget summary, and expenditures from March 25th, 2020 to September 30th, 2020. The next item is the federal report for 2019-20 CSI funds. For this federal reporting, LEAs will need to indicate the amount of funds distributed to each CSI school and also identify the strategies implemented with these funds. It's important to note that this federal report covers the 19-20 school year and the time period of March 25th, 2020 to June 30th, 2020. Both the Grant Management Report 1 and the federal report must be submitted through GMART. And it's also important to note that the federal report is a separate report that needs to be completed in GMART for 19-20 CSI funds. The federal reports are not listed in the 19-20 grant reporting timeline that's posted on the CDE webpage. However, the CDE's GMART walkthrough webinar on August 27th provided information on the timeline, process, and information needed to complete the federal reporting. And we've included the link to this webinar on the next slide. The last thing that's due is Report 5, and this is for 2018-19 CSI funds. And this is also submitted through the GMART system. And this report includes expenditures from July 1st, 2020 to September 30th, 2020. Next slide, please. So here we've provided the links to a number of resources to support you with the CSI requirements. The CDE CSI prompts webpage includes several resources such as the 2021 CSI prompts form and instructions, the PowerPoint from the CDE's CSI prompts walkthrough webinar, and also some frequently asked questions. The PowerPoint from the 1920 fiscal reporting in GMART walkthrough webinar is also posted on the CDE webpage on the CSI webinars webpage. And this PowerPoint, as mentioned, provides helpful information on what needs to be submitted for the federal reports in GMART, as well as the grant management reports. We've also included the links to the PowerPoint and recording for the LACO CSI workshop that was held last week. And this workshop went into more details on the requirements for CSI plans and the CSI prompts, including the components to be included in the responses for approval of the prompts. And that concludes my section. I will now turn it over to Amy for some CARES Act updates.
Thank you, Rachel. So in this next section, I'll be sharing some slides. I'll provide a summary of CARES Act funding, reporting, allowable uses, and some additional resources that you may want to reference as you implement actions planned within your LEAs. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so first, let's start with this graphic, which is intended to explain the relationships between the various subfunds allocated to LEAs that are contained within the CARES Act. So this is kind of a blocky Venn diagram of sorts, because on the left in the purple box, there are two subfunds that the CARES Act included specifically to support LEAs, which are the ESSER and GEAR. Within the CARES Act, these two funding sources are referred to as part of the Education Stabilization Fund. So the Education Stabilization Fund consists of those two subfunds. LEAs completed applications for ESSER back in July, so those were, you received those preliminary allocations first before the, ahead of these other three. And so while the GEAR funding came later, it got packaged along with the Coronavirus Relief Fund, referred to as CRF, and the General Fund, referred to as GF. And those three subfunds together were allocated as part of the 2020-21 budget package, and those got referred to as learning loss mitigation funds. Next slide, please. This slide provides an overview of those CARES Act funds, their resource codes, and when the funds can be used, also referred to as the covered period. There have been a number of questions about the timelines, especially in regards to the obligation and liquidation of coronavirus relief funds, which has a deadline coming up of December 30th. And so we'll be also discussing that towards the end of this section. Note here also, Bonnie will be going into this a little bit more, but ESSER and GEAR are subject to equitable services marked by an asterisk, and all these funding sources will be included in the single audit. Next slide. So the CDE has created a nice web page that they are calling the CARES Act Reporting Help page. If you haven't come across this page yet, we have provided a link, the last slide of this section. But this page provides helpful information around the required reports that LEAs will submit for each of the subfunds. And we thought we'd provide you an overview and kind of walk through what's contained within this resource. There is a lot of detail in that page, as well as the guidance I'll be referencing. But so our intent today is just to kind of give you a general overview. The page, the web page starts with some tips and information that will be collected under the general information section of the reporting, including the DUNS, the identification of your congressional electoral district and officers, And a note about the officers, there are conditions in which an LEA would need to report their 5 most highly compensated officers, but the CDE does say that this would apply to very few LEAs that the CDE manages. Next slide. And then the next 2 sections in that helpful webpage, for each of the funds, they provide an overview explaining terms such as total allocated amount, total received amount, previous expended amount, and current expended amount, which are defined pretty much just how they sound. The first 3, total allocated, total received, and previous expended, come pre-populated in the report, and the LEA is then required to report the amount of funds that they have expended during the current reporting period under current expended amount. Under the funds expended, LEAs will be required to provide information that details how they spent their CARES Act funds for each of the different subsets of funds. And this will be accomplished by indicating the percentage of the total amount expended that has been used in each of the allowable use categories. So the next couple slides will show you those allowable use categories. Next slide, please. The ESSER is a subset, as we stated earlier, of the Federal Education Stabilization Fund pursuant to Section 18003 of the CARES Act. And that was that funding that was allocated to states based on Title I funding. And so these are the 12 reporting categories. And if you remember seeing those same 12 categories in some previous presentations, they align to those that you see in that CARES Act language. And so as staff involved in making decisions around use of funding and which CARES Act subfunds to charge or actions related to the COVID emergency, it is important to understand what those allowable uses and categories are, so that you would know in which area that those would be filed. So there may be some cases where you're implementing actions, and when it comes to reporting, there might be some additional considerations that need to go into that. Let's take a look at the next slide, which is the LLMF reporting, which are those 3 other subfunds of the CARES Act: GEAR, GF, and CRF. And these are aligned with the allowable uses that were established in Section 110D of SB 98, and that was amended by SB 820. And as a general note, all 3 of these subfunds have the same 10 allowable uses because they were packaged as LLMF. But what is also important to know is that where GEAR and ESSER are subject to certain requirements because they're education funds, they are going to be subject to Uniform Grants guidance, including areas related to cash management, indirect costs, maintenance of efforts, and they're also subject to equitable services. So GEAR, taken from this one subset of LLMF, has slightly different rules, whereas the general fund is a little less restrictive because it is state money. And then CRF on its own, also less restrictive, but parts of the Uniform Grants guidance still do apply. And you will see shortly some additional requirements or restrictions to CRF will be included as well. So they have some specific guidance just for CRF. So while they're packaged together with the same allowable uses, there's some other important things to note. Next slide, please. So on this slide here, ESSER and GEAR, because they are, as stated earlier, subject to the Uniform Grants guidance. CDE recently posted this form to their website, and it only applies to ESSER and GEAR and not to CRF or GF, but this is the capital expenditures pre-approval application. So for it's a requirement for capital expenditures for special purpose equipment with a cost of $5,000 or more, and those should have prior written approval as per the Code of Federal Regulations. Next slide, please. So we talked about CRF having some specific guidance. And so this is shared from the recent CRF guidance for states. The Treasury released these specific guidance for coronavirus relief funds. Updated guidance was actually released pretty recently, September 2nd. These funds were not intended to be used to cover shortfalls in revenue. And while the default position was to spend these new funds on new items relative to the response to COVID, there's certainly a need for new purchases, but LEAs are looking at also maybe possibly current expenditures that can be allocated to CRF. And so there's some caution here in terms of LEAs being careful when considering whether or not any current expenditures could be allocated to CRF. And so the guidance states that payments be used only to cover costs that were not accounted for in the budget they most recently approved as of March 27, 2020. That is the date where COVID became an emergency for the CRF covered period. And the CRF guidance says that a cost that will meet this requirement if either the cost cannot lawfully be funded using a line item allotment or allocation within that budget that was approved, or if the cost is substantially different use from any expected use of funds in that budget. And so take a look at the next slide. Since payroll and benefits account for a large portion of a district budget, this is likely an area for careful consideration. The Treasury considers the requirement that payments from the fund from CRF be used only to cover those costs not accounted for in the budget most recently approved as of March 27th. And that condition would be met if either the costs cannot be lawfully funded, so it wasn't previously approved in the budget adopted as of March 27th, or if that cost is substantially different from any expected use of funds in that budget. So for example, this is an example they give in that guidance, redeploying educational support staff to provide technology support for distance learning would be considered substantially different use if that was not originally a part of their ordinary duties. In addition, within this category of substantially different use, employees should provide that services are substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 public health emergency in order to justify their full payroll and benefits to be covered through CRF. There's additional language contained within this supplemental guidance specific to CRF that's kind of outside the scope of today's presentation, but I wanted to just make note of that so that you're aware of that guidance, which you can reference when making decisions within your LEA. So this is just a little bit of a taste for what's contained within there. Next slide, please. So here with the coronavirus relief funds again, and the short timeline with the deadline to spend by December 30th, there have been a number of questions that we've received at LACO, I'm sure the state's been receiving, and so the US Treasury released some clarification. CRF payments may only be used to cover costs incurred during the period between March 1st and December 30th, which they refer to as the covered period. And for a cost to be considered incurred, performance or delivery must occur during that covered period, but payment can be made afterwards, although generally payment is expected to take place within the next 90 days. So this is a clarification that they provided, which aligns also with a FAQ I'll share in a couple slides from CDE. But next slide, I want to point out a few examples from that guidance. Guidance presents several examples for LEAs and around these different scenarios, such as those related to lease of equipment or other property, goods purchased and delivered, and when those goods could be available for use, special conditions for goods purchased in bulk, purchase of durable goods, and some notes about the timeline. So this is kind of helpful in terms of comparing it to scenarios that you might have happening in your district to help you make those decisions. That last bullet is around that delay of delivery due to circumstances beyond the LEA's control. I know that's been a concern for some as well. and that could be caused by failure of the vendor to deliver goods on time. And this does not affect, guidance has clarified that this does not affect the ability of the LEA to use CRF for payment. And let's take a look at that next slide, where the CD also kind of echoes this concern. So the FAQ around late delivery of devices, which is probably one of the goods that many districts are considering for purchase using LLMF. And so the CD has clarified that in line with the FAQ from the Treasury, CRF may still be used for payment if devices are delivered past the December 30th deadline, if the delayed delivery was due to circumstances beyond the LEA's control, such as supply chain interruptions. But devices should have been ordered with the intent and expectation to receive delivery by December 30th. In other words, placing an order late in December, which would be an extreme example, like placing an order on December 25th and trying to say that you hope to get the delivery by December 30th, would then not be eligible for payment from CRF, because it would be difficult to demonstrate that the expectation was for delivery by December 30th and that the purchase was necessary due to the COVID-19 emergency within the covered period. So this is, I think, a helpful clarification for many. In the last slide here, this slide here has all the links to the documents that were referenced in this section of the presentation. The ones in bold are the ones that we reference specifically for the reporting and allowable uses, as well as the specific guidance and FAQ around the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And the little tiny screenshot is the CDE's CARES Act funding overview table, which provides some, it's a nice helpful resource that kind of puts it all in one place as well. So hopefully, if you haven't come across these, you found that helpful just to have as a reference as you're continuing to implement your actions around coronavirus relief. Thank you. We have next Bonnie, continuing on.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, following up on that with CARES, we're want to provide an update on some new developments relative to CARES and equitable services. This is a subject we thought was settled last month, but we've had some new developments that have raised some additional questions and hopefully settled some others. So let's take a look at what we know, which is next. What we know and what we have known from the beginning, that there are a few basic requirements and understandings that are clear. And as simple as it sounds, they have led to some confusion. First, we know that the CARES Act requires LEAs to provide equitable services under ESSER, the Elementary and Secondary School Relief Fund, and GEAR, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, both of which Amy just discussed previously. So we know that is a requirement. Secondly, we know that based on the CARES Act language, services to students and teachers in non-public schools should be provided in the same manner as under 1117 of ESEA. And we also know that 1117 of ESEA refers to Title I equitable services requirements. So those are three pieces of factual information we know. They should be simple, but they've raised some questions. So let's take a look at what some of those questions are and where you are. This is sort of our picture of how you might be feeling right now. And some of the reasons that you're feeling that way are, we've been given, first of all, we have the law and pretty straightforward. Some districts started thinking about it. Some of you are just getting things organized with school closures. But soon after that, we got federal guidance that conflicted with the language in the law. So that provided some confusion to districts. Secondly, we had legal challenges that resulted from that guidance, which sort of put things on hold as to how to proceed given the pending legal decisions. Then after that, the department withdrew the guidance and issued interim regulations. And those interim regulations, again, settled some things, but they raised new questions about the use of funds. And then finally, various court decisions came about, and those court decisions appeared to provide some clarity, but we still had lingering questions. And if you were on the CD website, you would notice they said, this is a very fluid situation. So let's take a look at the source of the confusion. The source of the confusion is really that the guidance and the interim rules had language in them that conflicted with the language in the law. So as a district, your question was, what do I follow? Do I follow what's in the law? Do I follow what's in the guidance? Now do I follow what's in the regulations? Then there were multiple lawsuits that challenged this interpretation, and there were three key issues, but number one was really the focus was on how to determine the equitable share. That was the source of most of the conflict. Secondly, there were issues about how services should be provided, and then there were implications for public school programs raised in the interim regulations. So just let's review the chronology on the next slide. Okay, here's a sort of a timeline of what happened. So first, you had CARES Act was released, and shortly after that, there was guidance released by the department, and it directed LEAs to use total enrollment to calculate the equitable share. This was the first source of confusion because this appeared to conflict with what was in the law that said use the Title I formula. Next, we had some federal court decisions that determined that use of the formula that was set forth in the guidance was inconsistent with the language in the law. In response to that, the U.S. Department issued interim final rules that provided for an option. LEAs could choose to use total enrollment, or they could base it on low income numbers. However, the interim rule also placed restrictions on LEAs using low income counts to determine the equitable share. Those restrictions included only being able to use CARES funds in Title I public schools, and it also imposed a supplement, not supplant requirement on the public schools. So litigation moved forward, and we finally had three cases that found against the department, and the final one did say that this language conflicted with the unambiguous text of the statute, and therefore the interim guidance was void. So on September 25th, the Department of Education published a letter saying they would not appeal the decision. And this is where we left off the last time we spoke with you. It appeared that everything was settled. We were using the Title I allocation formula. We were going back to the drawing board and trying to figure out what that meant. But then we had a new development, and that was the issuance on October 9th. So shortly after that, the U.S. Department of Education released new guidance on providing equitable services under the CARES Act. And you can find that posted on our website with the meeting handouts. This guidance actually confirms and clarifies some of the requirements. However, it raises some questions and may impact how districts have been proceeding in providing those services. So we want to take a look at what some of those clarifications are and what some of the changes are. Essentially, they're fall into two areas. The guidance aligns with what has been understood at the end of September, last time we met, and we had the department saying they were not going to appeal. The guidance aligns with that understanding regarding how the equitable share is to be determined. So there's no change in that. Where it deviates is from Title I and from how many districts were proceeding is in determining which schools will be served and how that takes place. So let's take a look at some of the key areas in the guidance. And this is just a list of some of the areas that either provide clarification or they raise questions. So let's take a look at some of those. And I would suggest that you also, I draw your attention to one that isn't listed here, and that is question number 8. As you read it, it sounds like it's nothing new, but it might have some significant impact, and we'll take a look at that later. So let's take a look at each of these. First, let's look at what guidance is. Yeah, next slide. That was good. Okay. So what is the role of federal guidance? Okay. And federal guidance, as it says in the purpose, right in the first pages of the document, that guidance does not have the effect of law, and it's not meant to be binding in any way. It doesn't create or confer rights. It only clarifies existing requirements under the law. Next slide gives you a sort of a hierarchy of how these work. We have laws, and we know what the law is basic, that's foundational. And any rulings go back to what does the law say. But as you know, sometimes reading the law, it's not really clear. What does that mean? How does that work in the real world? Regulations are the first step in providing clarity. Regulations are a formalized process that go through a public comment period, and the agency has to respond to those questions before implementing regulations. So regulations have greater authority. They don't have the authority of law. They can't change the law, but they can clarify and provide direction relative to the law. After that, you'll see guidance. Guidance is different from regulations. The interim rule was the first step in developing regulations. The interim final rule was in the comment period, but the department said they felt it had the force of regulations, even though it was still in process. So that's why when we had the interim final rule, many districts started moving forward, because it is a higher level of authority than does have guidance. Now we have new guidance, and guidance is what's developed. It's developed within the agency by agency staff with the purpose of helping local agencies by clarifying issues of implementation. What does it look like when you actually are implementing these programs? So it's closer to the field. As you know, it's generally in a Q&A sort of format. It can clarify, but it can't change what's in law. And there's no requirement for an LEA to follow non-regulatory guidance. However, following it generally provides a reasonable assurance that your actions align with how the department is interpreting the law. So people feel it's a safe harbor, although it actually isn't. It's not something that you can rely on in legal action, but it does give you a sense that you're operating under what the department's understanding is. So I just wanted to clarify what guidance is, because you do have an option of following guidance or not if you question it. Next slide. Okay, so let's look at the first question, which is number 2, and it talks about eligibility. And here we're looking at the eligibility date. And one clarification that was not provided before was that there are 2 requirements for a non-public school to be eligible for CARES Act services. One is that it was in existence prior to the date of the emergency, which is March 13th. So if you have new private schools that opened after that date, they would not be eligible for services. And secondly, which is the same as ESSA, that it can't be a for-profit school, it must be a nonprofit school. To check that, you can go to the CDE list of non-public schools that's used for determining equitable services under ESSA. And there's a column there that has a tax-exempt status. In fact, there are multiple ways a private school can be identified as tax-exempt, and they need to show up in one of those columns. You may also ask for verification of their tax-exempt status. CDE doesn't do a verification process, so if you have any question, you can certainly request verification of their tax-exempt status. All right, Next, let's look at question 4. And this is where we differ from what's been previously understood. The department has determined that under the CARES Act, and the LEA in which a non-public school is located is responsible for providing the services. Okay? This interpretation, although it matches what we understood under the regulations, it does deviate from a strict interpretation of how Title I services are provided, which means following the student's residence. So students are identified based on where if they're in a Title I school attendance area, and where they attend school doesn't matter. The funds follow the student. This is different. It's saying you would only serve the schools within your district boundaries. Again, this matches what our original understanding under the regulations is, but it does deviate somewhat from the manner of Title I, which is what some of you started working on after our last meeting. And our understanding was that was how we had to operate. Let's take a look at more on number 4. And this has 2 allowable uses. And this again clarifies that the services do not unlike Title I, the services do not follow a particular student, but any student or teacher in the non-public school may receive services. There's a note here, and we'll look at it again later, that's unless limited by a governor, and that would be the GEARS fund. So we'll take a look at that later. But the key idea here is you can serve any student. And then under both Title I and Part A, the guidance reminds us that the services have to be provided directly by the district, either through directly serving them or through a contract. So all purchases have to be made by the district. Services have to be delivered directly through the district or through a district contact with a vendor. This is no change from other ESSA programs, but it is a clarification. All right, let's look at the next one, which is related, and that's control of funds. And district control of funds is included under ESSA, so it's included for Title I, but it's also reiterated in the CARES Act. And they're very clear that control of funds must be with the district. So equipment and any non-consumable materials may remain with the private school as long as they're needed for the purposes of the CARES Act, which is addressing COVID. After that, anything should be returned to the district, or it could be transferred to another program operated at the private school, such an ESSA program. They have a Title I program, and the materials or equipment can be used for that program that can be transferred to the use of it. All equipment also has to be on your district inventory, just as it is with other ESSA programs. All right, proportional share. This is question 7, and it confirms what we understood. So those of you that have followed that guidance, that Title I requires a proportional share as a count of low-income students residing in Title I school attendance areas and attending nonprofit private schools located both in and outside the district boundaries. And this confirms it because this is what 1117A4A says. So if you've moved forward with that, you're good to go. You've determined the proportionate share, and this confirms it. Next, another requirement that's clarified in the guidance is the need for written affirmation. And this was mentioned earlier, but it's been reiterated here. So you need to have an affirmation of consultation. And we'll be posting a sample on our website, but all you have to do is take your ESSA affirmation and change the name to reflect the CARES GEAR and ESSER funding. So there's no additional requirements. Just use your form that you've used for affirmation and use that. Just change the title on it. All right. no eligibility reservices. So unlike Title I, CARES funds, and are not targeted only to students residing in a Title I attendance area. So if you only students receive service under Title I, if they are low achieving based on the criteria identified and they live in a Title I school attendance area. This is made clear, and there's been no controversy on this, that the funds are available based on what the CARES funds are about. They can be used for any allowable purpose under ESSER and GEAR, and that includes for GEAR funds, learning loss mitigation allowable uses. Okay, and the data for determining the proportional share is the data for may be used from either 2019 or 2020. So this is again consistent with what we've heard in the past. You don't need to take another count of poverty students unless you have new schools that wish to participate. They haven't participated in Title I before. So if you have your numbers for last year, you can use those numbers to determine the proportionate share. If you have numbers for this year, which you should have now for Title I purposes, you can use the same numbers you use for Title I purposes. If you need to collect poverty data, you need to consult with, if you have new schools, you need to consult with them and use the following on the next slide are from Title I, the ways in which you can collect poverty data. So these are just the ways you use for Title I. You can use the same measure, a survey. You can use the percentage in the attendance area, an equated measure. There are various options, same as you've always done for Title I. Again, this is through consultation, but it's the district's final decision which data you use. All right, next slide. All right, now school funding amounts. In this case, how do you determine the amount for individual schools? And this is where things become somewhat challenging. Okay. So they're saying after you reserve funds for administering the program, then you need to consult with the private school officials. Okay. Just a reminder on administrative caps, there is no specified administrative cap on CARES funds. However, the amount has to follow for GEAR and ESSER, it has to follow the reasonable and necessary requirements in the Uniform Grants Guidance. So what's reasonable and necessary, that 15% has generally been used by the department, but you need to show that it's reasonable and necessary. So you take your administrative costs first off the top, and then you provide, the guidance provides examples of how you might determine, how you're going to determine how much each school gets. And the example provided is use of poverty data for determining allocations. But the guidance doesn't mandate that you use poverty data. You could consult with the schools. It is possible to pool funds if you have similar schools under a particular auspices that want to work together. But how you determine that fund is up to the LEA based on consultation. So this is what's different, and this is what you might want to think about. Again, consultation's required, but the decision is with the LEA. Okay, you have to serve all those schools, but how are you going to determine? Are you going to use a per pupil based on poverty? How are you going to use which seems to fit with Title I, but not mandated. So let's take a look. The next kind of summarizes how you calculate funds and then how you provide services. So the proportionate share is again determined based on low-income students residing in Title I attendance areas, attending private schools inside and outside the district boundaries. No change from Title I, what you've always done. So that is set. Services, on the other hand, are nonprofit private schools within the district boundaries, and the amount allocated for services is determined through consultation. So that means working with your private schools, determining how you're going to serve those schools. And once again, I will draw your attention to item number 8 in the guidance, which sounds like it's nothing new, but the attorneys are interpreting this a little bit differently. And that is, must an LEA offer equitable services to students and teachers in all non-public schools located in the LEA, even if a non-public school has not previously participated in Title I, Part A? And the answer is yes. An LEA must offer to provide equitable service under CARES Act program to students and teachers in all non-public schools located in the LEA, even if a non-public school has not previously participated in Title I, Part A. Now, we focused on the section of that says if they have not previously participated. But what attorneys have been looking at is the all. And as they interpret it, that means all non-public schools in the district should be offered an opportunity to participate. However, depending on how you allocate the funds, that will determine how they're allocated out and which schools receive service. So I draw your attention to number 8 and take a look at that, because it's something we kind of skipped over, but the attorneys seem to be focusing on that as all schools have to be invited and consulted with, but not all schools might be served depending on how you determine the funds will be allocated. Okay. So this is the crux of where the guidance has raised some challenges. All right, let's see what we have next. Okay, this just reiterates what you already know. No change from ESSA, that districts may not provide funds directly to a private school. It's very clear in the guidance, very clear in the law. All services and products have to be paid for directly by the district. So you purchase equipment, it's got to be with you, with a contract, however your purchase orders, it all goes through the district, and you cannot pay the private school or reimburse private schools. Next, what do we have? Next is just again a reminder of GEAR. And the guidance clarifies that if the governor of a state has determined specific purposes for GEAR funds, then equitable services are subject to those requirements. And Amy reviewed that previously, but that is the learning loss mitigation funds include GEAR funds. And so any services to private schools need to be in line with the LLMF required allowable uses. Okay, just a few reminders, okay? As we just said, GEAR funds are part of learning loss mitigation funds, but learning loss mitigation funds includes multiple fund sources. And only the GEAR funds within learning loss mitigation are subject to equitable services. So make sure that your fiscal office is clear on that. It's not all the learning loss mitigation, it's only GEAR funds. Secondly, all the requirements, and Amy went over them earlier, all those requirements that apply to ESSER and GEAR for district funds also apply to use of those funds for equitable services under these programs. And then a final reminder is about capital expenses and expenditures for permanent improvements, because these are very different kinds of funds. But those kinds of costs cannot be allowed, because that's not something that the district can take back. It's a permanent improvement for the school. And these are your district funds. So if the program ends, the school is closes, whatever, you cannot take those back if they're permanent improvements. So those are not allowed, even though it might be allowed under a district program, it would not be allowed for equitable services. Okay. All right, so what do you do next? First of all, we'd say recalculate your equitable share if needed. If you've been doing it according to the Title I formula, then you're probably good on your calculation. But if you haven't, you want to go back and recalculate. Then if that changes, you need to determine what, if any, changes need to be made relative to funding. Did you Did you budget, over budget, under budget? What does that look like? Third, and I can't say this strongly enough, communicate and collaborate with your neighboring districts to make sure you're sending a common message and avoiding duplication of funding. All right. Private schools, just like you, have been under a state of confusion with this back and forth, and it's really important that all districts send a common message and that we're not giving differing messages, because what you'll hear is, well, this district told me this, why can't I do this? And it's going to take up time and energy that no one has. Communicating with your neighboring districts, making sure you're on target about how you're providing those services. If you started providing services to students out of district, then you need to consult with your private schools after you've talked with your neighboring districts and talk about how you're going to determine how you're going to transition those services and how you're going to work this out in a smooth manner that doesn't impact services. And then you need to consult with your private schools on how the funding amounts for services to individual schools are going to be determined. How are you going to make that decision about that equitable share? So those, I would say, would be the next steps that you need to take. And hopefully this will be the last presentation on this, right? So now I'm going to turn it over to, I believe it's Adrienne, to give you an FPM update.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Bonnie. Wow, I feel like this is a 7th inning stretch. So here we go, FPM update. So the FPM reviews have been, they started last month in September, and so far we're into the 2nd month of the reviews. And this is kind of the latest up-to-date findings. And as you can see, these are the top 11. 9 out of the 11 are in the English Learner Program, and 2 are in the CE, reflecting the school site council composition in terms of not only just elections, but elected by peers, and that they're taking place. And also CE 19, which is the school site evaluation of program effectiveness. So again, it's that monitoring and determining the effectiveness of the programs at the site. So again, if you look at all of this, you see that quite a bit is in the English Learner Program. So you may want to really take a deeper look at your English Learner Program and make sure that you have everything in place and are implementing all your federal programs. But again, this is just kind of a pulse on where we are as of October in this new school year during the pandemic. So there have been some changes in the Uniform Complaint Procedure. And if you didn't know that, you might be caught with not being prepared with all the updates that have to take place in your policies and procedures. So we did want to point this out because this is new. And so if you look on the CD website and you follow this link, you will see the Uniform Complaint Procedure Monitoring page. And on this page, you will find information that has changes to the regulations, samples of the policies, and the evidence that's needed for this school year. Particularly, if you look on this page, you'll see the link for the letter. And this gives you the changes that were made to the Uniform Complaint Procedure Regulations, and it's dated July 1st, 2020. And so this letter explains all the changes that were made to the Uniform Complaint Procedure itself, such as filing complaints, the scope, and all the rest of the areas that have been identified in this letter. Also, if you go back to the monitoring page, you're also going to see the UCP comparison information. This document was created in September last month, and it goes over what was formerly the checklist of the comprehensive set of required statements that need to be included in the 6 different UCP policies, procedures, reports, notices, and forms that are aligned to the California Code of Regulations, Title V, and actually now the Penal Code has been added to this as well. So just so you can get a nice overview, as well as this is your checklist that to make sure that all of your procedures and policies have been updated based on this July and September information. So today we're going to take a closer look at the Uniform Complaint Procedure Instrument. So if you, in June or even in July at the FPM training, if you downloaded all of the instruments in preparation for your school year and looking at what changes have taken place, you would have downloaded the June 2020 UCP instrument. Well, in October, at the beginning of October, there has been a new UCP instrument that has been uploaded, and it is reflective of all those changes that I just mentioned prior to this slide. And so you want to, for all people, all districts and charters, to download this UCP new instrument so that you do have the latest information that you are to implement, and so you need to have this evidence. So here's some key changes from in the October 2020 UCP instrument. The June one had 22 pages. This UCP instrument now has 25 pages. UCP 1, 2, 3, and 5 have changes in those items. UCP 4 and UCP 6 do not have any changes per se. Some of the acronyms are written out, such as the LCAP is now written as the Local Control and Accountability Plan. There's also some reworded requirements, or there's added specific language, such as before it said the report, and now it is the LEA investigation report. So those are some nuances and some changes to the instrument. Also, there are a lot of ed code references that have been changed, and you can see that in all of these changes have taken place in ed code regarding the UCP instrument. So you can see that. A new requirement that has been added is in section K. And K says that there are currently 23 state and federal programs that are within the scope of the Uniform Complaint Procedure process. So now you must add a paragraph to your UCP policies and procedure documents, as well as in your UCP annual notice, with a list of the UCP programs that you operate, you file, investigate, and resolve using the board-approved UCP process. And secondly, for those of you that are being FPM this year, you would need to add a comment in the CMT explaining why you are not participating in any of the 23. If you are not participating in all 23, you would need to explain why you're not participating in any of those. Another new requirement that has been added is due to the pandemic, the COVID-19. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, all the required UCP informational notices that would normally be provided to all your district stakeholders, they usually have to have in a tangible format. Well, now you are able to, in addition to that, offer it in electronic format via your district website, electronic mail, texting, digital flyer applications, social media. And secondly, you'll need to take a look at UCP2, because you do have to verify how did you inform everyone regarding the distribution of your UCP annual notice. So in addition to perhaps a student-parent handbook that perhaps this was typically given out, you also have to include how did you do it electronically as well. So everyone is affected by this change. Everyone needs to take a look at the existing UCP procedures and policies and your distribution and make your necessary adjustments. So we definitely want to point this out, maybe add this to your compliance checklist for the upcoming month. Next, we're going to take a look at, if you are being FPM'd up from September until January, whether it's online or on site, the name of the process is the telemonitoring review. And so this includes interviews of your parents and staff, regardless of whether you're selected for an online review or an on-site. So in preparation, here are some questions that have been used recently as well as in the past. And this is just a sampling. We definitely have more, comprehensive lists. But again, would your school site council members be able to answer these questions? How are they elected? Do they know their responsibilities? How often do they meet? Do they know the topics on the agenda? How are they involved in the participation and development and updates of the school plan? Were they part of the process of the parent and family engagement policy and the school and parent compact? Did they attend the Title I parent meeting, and so forth? So here are some questions that you would prepare, and you want to just make sure that you have developed these within your day-to-day interactions with school site council members, so that it's nothing that you're making up, it's just you're reflecting what is happening. So again, you just sometimes need to remind your school site council members that the parent and family engagement policy, like exactly what it is. So if they are asked about it, they can answer truthfully. Also, here's some questions for the ELAC. Does your school have an active English learner advisory committee? Were the parents elected by parents? What is the role of the ELAC? Did the ELAC receive training on their roles and responsibilities? And did they give input to the school site council on the development of the school plan? So see, these are some things, again, to reflect the processes that you have in place. And if you do have them in place, then answering these questions are simple. And also intervention teachers. So in preparation for any type of interview, do your intervention teachers know how to articulate what their day looks like, how the students were chosen for that intervention program? Is there exit criteria? Is it a fluid process? How do they monitor the students and determine if there's academic gains? And do they know how their position is funded? Because obviously they would be doing time accounting. So again, these are some questions just to keep on your radar, again, to make sure that you have those processes in place. And now I'm going to turn it over to Evan, who's going to talk about CalPADS.
Thanks, Adrian. And we're watching the time here. We know we're getting close, so we may go a little bit over, but just a reminder, we always do record these webinars, and we upload them within 48 hours to our state and federal program website. So if you have to leave for any reason, be sure to come back, because you don't want to miss CalPAD stuff. Anyway, next slide, please. I want to give a quick update about CalPADS. We touched on it last time, but there have been some new developments since our last meeting. Just a quick shot of the calendar here. This is the submission deadlines for this year. These dates haven't changed substantially from prior years. Important note that the Fall 2 does not have a deadline, a certification deadline. Rather, the close the amendment window is in March is the final deadline. So there's really no amendment period. And CalPAD staff is always recommending that LEAs have their Fall 1 data as clean as possible by that December deadline, so that they'll have ample time to work on the Fall 2 data. Next slide, please. So as I touched on our last meeting, there's been some significant change in the data reporting for Fall 1, and then within, I think, 12 hours after I said that, there was a CalPADS Flash 191 released, and then the CalPADS information meeting was held last week. So I just wanted to update this group with some additional details. Again, the most important change probably for state and federal program directors are the changes to the data and how it's collected that informs report 1.17, the free and reduced price meals, the English learner foster youth count. As you may recall, this is the report that is used for the unduplicated pupil count, which determines the supplemental concentration grant funding under LCFF. The CDE will use the Fall 1 data that LEAs approved by the December 18th, 2020 certification deadline for the first principal apportionment, the P1 calculations. And then the CDE will use the data LEAs certify or recertify by the close of the amendment window at the end of January 29th, for the second principal apportionment. So you have some opportunities to make sure that data is clean as possible. Next slide, please. So here you see a screenshot of the actual CalPADS report 1.17. So notably, to be included in this certification report, students have to be enrolled on Census Day, October 7th. So it's already passed, but so any students who are enrolling after that date aren't going to get picked up, but there are some changes to how we collect free and reduced price meal, the English learner, that have been adjusted to be able to pull in students based on changes that are made to accommodate COVID-19. LEAs notably don't have to make any adjustments to reporting the dates, like they don't have to go back in and change the start of program dates to capture these. They've extended these deadlines, as you'll see in the next slide, to accommodate districts, to accommodate LEAs. Next slide, please. So in this table, you'll see how the collection has been modified. First, note that the eligibility dates for the free and reduced price meal programs were extended until December 31st, 2020. This means that CalPADS administrators won't need to go back and change the program start date for these students. They'll get picked up automatically. So anytime they're added, if they are enrolled as of October 7th and they are free and reduced price meal, they'll get picked up as late as December 31st. Now, one caveat to that is that the USDA, as you may know, recently extended the waiver for non-congregate settings through June 2021, which means that LEAs will operate under the summer meals program requirements through the rest of the school year. And under the summer meals program, the National School Lunch Program applications are not required. However, since California free and reduced price meal eligibility is based on the application, and it's a proxy for low income students, which is used in LCFF to determine students who are low income, LEAs may still need to collect the alternative household income form just for the LCFF purposes. Also note that under English language acquisition status, which is based on the initial English language proficiency assessment, the LPAC, has been extended. So this was described in Flash 189. The count will be adjusted to include students who not only were enrolled on Census Day, but who are identified as EL or ADEL, which I'll discuss in a moment, by December 31st. This extension was made to provide LEAs adequate time to assess students during the time of COVID, and also accommodates the Senate Bill 820, which allowed an extension for the initial LPAC to provide total 75 calendar days to administer it and score it. So this is an extension primarily for that. Finally, you'll see that the reporting period for students who are direct certified in CalPADS, who qualify based on enrollment in programs such as SNAP or TANF, was extended all the way into January. So those are automatically picked up. And again, these changes are done to automate the process, so LEAs do not have to revise program start dates to ensure eligibility for students to get counted in the report 1.17. Next slide, please. So importantly, you still have to have a program record, so you don't have to go back and change it, but just make sure that these are some other additional programs that qualify students for that free and reduced price meal category. So students who are migrant ed, students who are homeless due to recent fires, COVID, or other reasons, all need to have a program file on record. And those need to be that's primarily, those are students who are in the system prior to October 7th that had that status then. And then of course the school lunches I just talked about. So encourage you to continue collecting the meal information. Next slide, please. So this is the new information, the ADEL, and you may hear about it. Mostly this is just to clarify for people what this is. So beginning July 1st, a new English language acquisition status code, ADEL, Adult English Learner, was made available in CalPAD. This code is for students who are 22 years old or greater and who are enrolled in K-12 charter schools, which have federal partnerships with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, WIOA, the Job Corps, the California Conservation Corps, or Youth Build. So it's a very specific LEA that's going to need this code. And just if any of those schools are listening, so these charter schools can enroll students of any age, students 22 or older, even if they have been determined to be English learners through local assessment. But these students are not eligible to take the initial or summative LPAC. They do not qualify for Title III funding, and they are not included in the English learner student group on the California School Dashboard. What they do get picked up for, however, is for the additional supplemental and concentration grant funding. So if you're a charter that serves these students, just be aware of that. Next slide, please. So shifting gears a little bit, there are some additional components to the Fall 1 submission that state and federal program directors should be aware of, and primarily just to ensure that the right people within your LEA are reviewing this data for accuracy. So first is this report 2.14. This is the language instruction program count. And this is a fairly significant change from prior CalPADS reporting. The language instruction program, or LIP, is now submitted by student. It used to be submitted by course, but now every student needs to have a language instruction program. And this will be certified in Fall 1, not Fall 2. So this is coming up in the December certification. And just so you know, the LIP, it's a key element in reporting of English learner services that has implications not just for CalPADS, but also for federal accountability and assignment monitoring. So like I said, good to have somebody who knows this data look at it carefully. Next slide, please. Additionally, LEAs are required to submit student information to CalPADS for Title III eligibility. So who is eligible for Title III immigrant status? It's a person not born in any of the 50 states, DC or Puerto Rico. They've been in the US schools for 3 cumulative academic years or less, and they're between the ages of 3 and 21. So just since this data is used to determine Title III funding, state and federal program directors should ensure, again, some staff member who's most familiar with these eligibility criteria review these reports 2.1 and 2.2 prior to certification. Next slide, please. So this is another substantial change, and you're probably already familiar, but just want to go over just in case you aren't. So beginning in August of this year, LEAs began administering that online initial LPAC. And once a student has completed testing, it's actually the test operations management system which generates the English language acquisition status and reports it into CalPADS within 48 hours. So LEAs are no longer reporting that information. They get bypassed. So LEAs need to know that they need to implement a business process to download these the ELAS files from CalPADS and upload them into their local SIS on a regular basis so you can keep those records accurate. And that LEAs are also reminded that this process facilitates the determining and reporting of students' EL and IFEP statuses. So you can no longer change those statuses in CalPADS directly unless you're updating in conjunction with your correction reason code if you're doing online maintenance. So you can't change or delete those. Next slide, please. So shifting gears slightly to assignment monitoring, this is another component CalPADS is affecting. And so this year, the 2021 school year, which we're in, is actually the first, they'll call the consequential year for this reporting, meaning that the results of the assignment monitoring tool, CalSAS, will be used for the assignment monitoring authority for an LEA, whether it's the county office for districts or the authorizing district for charter schools, to determine if schools are properly assigning teachers. And so the CalPADS Fall 2 data, where the course assignment data, which includes teacher information, will be provided to the Teacher Credentialing Commission. That needs to be as accurate as possible. So districts have been given one assigned person who is in charge, who will have access to CalSAS reporting, and then that person makes that information available to all the people within the district who need that access to the reports from CalSAS, as well as to any authorized charter schools. So if you're in a charter school and you need to look at the CalSAS reporting on your teachers, you'll need to contact your authorizing LEA to get access to that. Next slide, please. So the 1920 assignment monitoring is occurring right now. It's occurring through December 30th. This is not a consequential year, so the CTC will not post this misassignment data, and LEAs should be able to see their own data through those reports generating CalSAS. They just need to get that access that I just referred to. However, the CDE is using this data for federal reporting, so I believe that would include SARC reporting. So it's good to make sure you take a look at that and make sure that that is as accurate as possible. Next slide, please. So what's going on with the current assignment monitoring, the CTC has identified potential misassignments and loaded those exceptions in CalSAS. I know we've talked to at least one district where, you know, they had an issue. So we're not experts here in assignment monitoring, but just to know, and I'll give you some resources in a minute. Once you've identified the process and you've identified who these, who may be out of, who is an exception, there is an option if it's a data error that an LEA can use to identify an exception as an error until they correct some things. There's definitely some errors that are some issues that are rising that are being worked out. Next slide, I'll give you some resources. Sorry, there you go. These are where you should direct your any assignment monitoring questions. So if you have questions, first you should go to the, if you're a district, go to the county office, our assignment monitoring folks. And if you're a charter school, whether you're a direct funded or locally funded, or you report independently, you should still be going to your authorizing agency and talking to whatever assignment monitoring official is there. And then any questions that arise, districts need to address those to CalSAS. Next slide. And conveniently enough, they just announced this week that the CDE and CTC are hosting a weekly 1 hour virtual office hours for people to post questions. And I think a lot of questions are coming up. And, you know, the big factor that that assignment monitoring will affect is the federal addendum. We'll dive into that deeper in a future meeting, but just so you know, if your HR people are finding issues with assignments based on 1920 data, it's there are some resources to go to help fix that. And so now I'm going to hand it off to Jeannie, talk about the learning continuity plan.
Thank you, Evan, and good morning, everyone. We're on the home stretch, and I'll move us quickly through with the learning continuity plan. So I'm going to provide a review and update on where we are with the timeline and process for the learning continuity plan. So on the next slide, we can see this chart provides the process and timelines related to submission and review of the learning continuity plan for districts, charters, and county offices. So LEAs were required to adopt their learning continuity plan by September 30th, and 5 days following the adoption of the plan, the school district submitted the plan to their county office for review, and charter schools submitted their plan to their chartering authorizer and to the county office. Then by October 30th, the reviewing authorities for districts and county offices may submit recommendations in writing for amendments to the learning continuity plan. And so currently this is the process in which LACO is involved in currently completing the review of the submitted learning continuity plans and determining where recommendations may be provided. Following recommendations, within 15 days of receiving recommendations from the county office, a governing board of the school district or county office shall consider the recommendations submitted by the reviewing authorities in a public meeting within 15 days of receiving the recommendations. Let's take a look at the next slide and talk about considering recommendations and where we are in determining if an LEA is going to receive recommendations. So it's important to note that the quick time frame in which new requirements establish the learning continuity plan and the related CARES funding, including learning loss mitigation funds, to address the impacts of COVID-19, along with all of the complexity of the situations districts are facing in addressing health and safety requirements and addressing a new school year under unprecedented conditions, has recognizably caused some confusion across counties and statewide. And we recognize that addressing these new requirements in this new plan created in response to the pandemic and the continuing obligation to increase or improve services for English learners, low income, and foster youth has been challenging, especially in a short time frame. So understandably, given this context, many districts in our county are receiving some recommendations for amendments to the learning continuity plan based on our review of the plans. As we have completed the reviews, we have been meeting with district contexts to discuss the review of the learning continuity plan and have shared where there will be recommendations for amendments. It's important to note that there are no legislative requirements defining how an LEA considers recommendations for any amendments that may be provided by the county office. However, many LEAs have shared with us how they are planning to consider any recommendations for amendments to their plans. And I'm going to just share some of what they have shared with us. Some have shared that they will be including the recommendations publicly during the superintendent's update, in which the superintendent will share the recommendation. Others have indicated that the superintendent will share the discussion held with the county office regarding the review of their plans, and some will be presenting an approach for responding to the recommendations. We've learned that some districts are including information about the recommendations as information items or action items on their agendas. And some districts are including the recommendation letter in their agenda item, as well as using some of the information from the letter to summarize the board item on their board agenda. We've also learned that some districts will be sharing some revisions they intend on making to their plan in response to the recommendations for amendments. And some districts have indicated that they had been continuing to work on their plan and were intending on making some additions. So they will share those as they respond to the recommendations for amendments. There are many approaches to considering the recommendations, and the district will need to determine their process for considering any recommendations at their public board meeting. As districts are determining the process they will follow for considering any recommendations, it will be important to reflect how their process will be transparent for all stakeholders in the community so that it supports an understanding of the steps the district will take to implement the requirements in the learning continuity plan. And additionally, it will be important to keep in mind how the process will connect to the budget overview for parents, which is going to be completed in December, which has a section that connects to the learning continuity plan. Next slide, please. In addition to considering the recommendations at a public board meeting, all LEAs must prominently post the learning continuity plan on the homepage of their website. And this would include posting any revisions the LEA is making to the learning continuity plan. County offices also are required to post the learning continuity plans submitted by school districts, as well as those submitted by charter schools. So LACO will be posting those plans on the LACO website. If a plan has a revision, an LEA may submit their revised plan through the LACO ELCAP, and then we can provide an updated posting of those revisions on the LACO website. So we would ask if you would like for your updated plan to be posted, to submit it through the ELCAP system. And you would do that the same way as you submitted your initial submission. You would just be submitting an additional submission using the same process. And finally, to wrap up our presentation for today, we wanted to remind you of an upcoming webinar this coming Tuesday at the CDE Tuesdays at 2. And the CDE is seeking stakeholder input related to the revision of the annual update template and the instructions that will be made for the 2021-22 school year. So that's this Tuesday at 2, and the login information is included. We will be providing input, and we'll also share what we learned from the webinar with you in a future meeting or in a future correspondence. Next slide, please. As always, please reach out to us anytime with questions and answers, or questions, and we will provide some answers for you. And you can do that through the chat. You can email us at any time. Our contact information is on the next slide. You can reach out to any of the coordinators or to our SFP at laco.edu. And with that, we'll keep the meeting open for a few more minutes if you have a question you want to include in the chat. And I thank you on behalf of the team for joining us today. Have a good rest of the day.